Alrighty, we are live. Welcome y'all to Destructuring Tech, the podcast where we unpack the complexities of tech and software into simpler topics. Now, the term destructuring is better known in JavaScript as a way to unpack values from complex data types, such as an array or an object. It's a fancy term for breaking something down. And that is our goal here as we bring in people from the industry, be it developers, leaders, or people who work adjacent in the tech realm. This is our very first episode. And if you're tuning in live, thank you for being here. Grab a bag of popcorn, be a part of the discussions in the chat, and ask questions. And we hope you have a great time. My name is Travis Rollins. I'm a developer as well as an instructor at the Turing School of Software and Design. I've been in this industry for about 4 years now, and although I've learned a lot in that time, there's still just so much to learn. I'm excited to introduce our first special guest, Cassandra Torski. Thank you so much for volunteering to be on this first episode. How are you doing today, Cass?
Doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's Monday, just starting the week. Did you have a good weekend?
It was great. Yeah, no complaints.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, always good. Great way to start out the week. Hopping on a podcast, right? So, well, excited to have you here. I'm sure some listening in may be familiar with you. Some, however, may not be. You're currently an instructor on the front-end program at Turing. But what were you doing previously before you came to Turing?
Yeah, so directly before coming to Turing, I worked at a consulting firm. So I got to jump around on tons and tons of different projects and work with different teams and different people. And it was an amazing learning opportunity. Before that, I worked on a very product-specific team for a company based out of Boulder. And then before that, I worked at Galvanize as an instructor.
Nice. Awesome. So you've kind of had the whole a little bit of everything, it sounds like, between being an instructor and then working more in development, working on various different projects, and now you're back as an instructor. What was kind of like what kind of brought you back to wanting to be an instructor?
Coming back to being an instructor was always the goal. I just wanted to get some experience out there. And once I decided to leave my last job, I was kind of soul searching, like what's next for me? And I was like, you know what? It's time. I'm just going to go back to doing what I love. This time with maybe a few more tools in my pockets.
Yeah, absolutely. Always growing and always moving to that next thing. So, well, that's terrific. Well, we're excited to have you here. How long has it been since you've been working at Turing now?
Oh, geez. I don't. 2 months?
2 months, 3 months,
2.5
somewhere
months.
around there. Yeah. It's crazy. It feels like it was just yesterday when you first came in, like interviewing and stuff like that. But yeah, it may not sound like a lot, but Turing time, couple months can feel like a very long time. So, but yeah, it's been terrific. So, well, I know we got a lot of great topics to talk about. And so definitely want to get into those. But curious, so you taught at Galvanize, you've worked at a couple other companies. Were you doing anything prior to software development, or is this something that you did right from the beginning? You knew like software development is going to be your jam.
I wish I would have known that. I took the round way, like the long way around. And I know I studied music and education in college. So that basically means I can play the clarinet really well. And I also had to take a lot of education classes. With that degree, there's only one thing you can do, and that's teach music. So that's what I did for a few years. I taught elementary music, so like recorders and ukuleles and things like that. But it was ultimately not a good fit. And so I, through various means, discovered, more fast-paced learning opportunities for coding, like what Turing does, and went through a program, a full stack program that's kind of similar to it. And that's how I got into coding. So I wish I would have known from the beginning, but I did not.
Yeah. No, that's okay. It's similar case for me as well. I also was in the musical background. I was a violist, went through college, got my master's in it, played with various orchestras, but education definitely is the key piece around there. I never actually did teaching large scale classes. It's funny that you bring up the recorder. I remember doing that as a kid as well. Great times. Don't remember anything about it, but it was a great time. So, but yeah, it's part of life, right? You kind of go through different phases and find different things that you're excited about. So, was there ever anything that you did, whether as a child or anything like that, that you were excited about tech, even though it hadn't quite hit you at that time?
Sure. My father is a tinkerer of kinds, always getting his hands into something that's tech related. And so whenever I would get to hang out with him, I was pretty much always doing something science-y and STEMmy. And it was always a good time. So that was part
Yeah,
of the reason why, as an adult, I came back to it.
absolutely. Yeah, it's funny how we always, I don't know, it seems like we end up finding a way back to our childhood passions or the things that we enjoy, right? So, um, well, awesome. So I imagine as you've worked at various companies, you've probably worked with a lot of different technologies. So just curious, what kind of technologies, either front end or whatever it might be, or frameworks have you worked with in the past?
Yeah, so I guess to start off, in my last teaching gig, it was full stack. So we did, JavaScript, vanilla, frameworks, Node.js, and Express as well. And
Cool.
the cohorts that I was working with could choose what framework they wanted to work with. So I got experience with AngularJS, OG Angular,
Hmm.
and Vue and React as well. But I didn't get really any like deep diving hands-on experience in any of that. My
Sure.
first gig was Vue only, and it was completely serverless. This was my first foray into AWS and
Yeah.
basically how to give data to a server living somewhere else, using lambdas and things like that. And
Awesome.
then as a consultant, uh, all over the place. Most often, the tech stack we would use was Node.js with Express, some kind of ORM, and then on the front end, we would usually use React with a Redux and standard React router ecosystem.
Awesome.
But that being said, there were also Ruby projects, Vue projects, yeah, little bits and pieces sprinkled out throughout the entire experience.
A little bit of everything. That's amazing. Um, that's really cool. I mean, I think having that exposure to so many different things really says a lot. And I mean, having that experience is really cool too. I'm curious, when you were teaching, and you mentioned students can kind of choose whatever framework they would like to get into. Was there ever a common theme, or was there a popularity around one versus another?
Definitely. A lot of students come in with one thing in their mind, thinking this is the way to go. But it can come down to so many different factors. And we would usually ask students to go through a lot of job postings and find what is most common right now and go for that one.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah, 100%. That definitely makes sense for sure. So, well, with having that experience, you mentioned, I think your first job, you were working with Vue, and then kind of extended to doing some things with React, building things out with Node.js, but extending from there, what would you say? if you had to like highlight like a few of those key frameworks, maybe it's React, Vue, and let's say Angular, what would you say are like some of the strengths or pros of each of those? Is one better than the other like all the time, or are there like certain places where it makes more sense to use one versus another?
Sure. There's definitely no like best framework. I definitely have a favorite, of course, but it's not the best. They're all objectively good, and they all have their strengths.
Sure.
Mainly, I like to highlight the differences between maybe Vue and React. And one of the big things that stands out is that React is very unopinionated. It's basically like writing JavaScript with a few extra steps. And I think that's why it's so popular, is because if you know JavaScript, you can get started going really easy with React. For me, I think it's very difficult to know what best practice is because there's so many options. And because there's so many options, there's so many differing opinions and resources on that. So like the opposite end of the spectrum, out of the three we've chosen, there are some that are more opinionated out there, is probably Vue. Like at this point, there's two kind of different ways to write a component, for example, but for the longest time through Vue 2, version 2, there was really only like one way to do things. And there's a place you have to put your methods. There's a place to put your data. You don't kind of just have this nebulous component that you can fill up with whatever you'd like. So a lot of developers don't like that because you're kind of confined and constricted. And on the same note, the ecosystems for both are kind of differing as well. There's pretty much always used sort of libraries for Vue, and then there's a lot of different options for React. Angular is kind of the odd one out because it's grown so fast I don't even know where it's at this point. The last Angular I worked in was Angular 4.
Sure.
And to me, there was just a lot going on. So I don't know that I can really speak to it anymore. There's also a question of data binding, and a lot of people will pit these frameworks against each other because of how they bind data. But I think at the end of the day, they all are doing basically the same thing. So they're all good choices, and it really comes down to what kind of tools do I want to use with it, and do those tools exist?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, sounds like personal preference with some of it, especially with the data pieces to it. You mentioned like the last one you worked with Angular was Angular 4. I know like React, I forget exactly what version it is. It's like version 16, version 17. Is it similar in that sense, but they're like little iterations, or is like Angular, would you say, is like something that's like massive differences between the different numbers?
I'm not sure after Angular JS. The difference between Angular JS, which is like Angular 1X, to Angular 2 is like completely different. They're basically different frameworks. I mean, like not entirely. That's an exaggeration, but pretty much. So I would assume that they are starting to do kind of smaller, like non-breaking sort of versions, or breaking in a sense that it's reasonable. I like React seems much more fluid to me from version to version.
Yeah. It seems like they definitely like pay attention to, because there's so many people using these frameworks, like trying not to implement breaking changes. So if I want to upgrade to a newer version, like, okay, I could probably use some of the newer features, but I'm also not left behind, or at least I have some kind of warning in that sense. So yeah, very cool. I think just for our listeners out there, if you're like, I have no idea what a framework is exactly, to put it in like a simpler term, I would say like frameworks provide us a kind of standard way to build and deploy applications. There's a lot of them out there, as Cass is kind of bringing up, but it's essentially a universal or reusable software environment that provides particular functionality as part of a larger software platform to facilitate that development of applications and products. So hopefully that helps a little bit more, but essentially just a way, an environment that allows us to produce applications faster and kind of all be on the same page. So especially for like a development team. So I'm curious, as you've had to like learn various frameworks, Cass, what would you say was like the learning curve? Was there a higher learning curve to learning React versus Vue, or did they feel about the same? What was your experience?
I think I may have an abnormal experience only because I started with AngularJS. That was my first one. And Vue
Sure.
is kind of like what AngularJS would have been if it had kept being itself instead of being turned into modern Angular. So I think I felt that Vue had the least learning curve, but it was already so familiar to me, I think is why. React was much more of a learning curve because I kept expecting there to be like these built-in directives, and I kept expecting there to be more rules than there were. But objectively, I don't really think that there's much of a difference between them.
Sure. Yeah, I think kind of to your point, like in some ways I could see it like being a benefit as well as a downside to this idea of like Vue. It sounds like you stated, has more opinions around it, and so potentially could be maybe easier to kind of be like, okay, here's like the practice, here's the best practice that I should be following through. Whereas I've worked in a handful of React projects, and there's some like underlying themes, there's some common pieces, but there's also a lot of flexibility in how things are structured, the various libraries that you're using with it. Like you mentioned, you used Redux with React, which kind of changes the whole or changes a lot about how like data is being managed. So which I'm sure there are things like that with Vue as well, but just very interesting in that like sometimes it's better to have like that more free form depending on what you're trying to do with it. Sometimes if you're like trying to get into something, maybe having a stronger opinion or something to kind of grasp onto makes it a little bit easier to kind of get along. So but awesome. Well, I guess I have to ask this because I'm one of those people that like is super nerdy about like testing, and just curious, like throughout the various companies that you were working at, the various frameworks, what have you used in the past to test something like an Angular app or a Vue app or a React project?
Sure. So right off the bat, I'll say I didn't test the Angular apps that I worked in. They were like, they lived with another company. So that company had like their own team that wrote tests, unfortunately. But so I don't know about that. But for React and Vue, the tools are very similar. Often we just use Jest. And then for like, there's like some minimal like built-in expectation stuff there, I believe, if I remember right. But we would often like pair it with something else. So for example, one of the React projects used the like React testing utility library, which was new at the time and very exciting. But often we would use things like Enzyme, things of that sort. I'm trying to think. My last project, I liked the testing situation the best because we'd unit tests with Jest. I think we just used Jest alone. And then we had Cypress for end-to-end testing, which I loved because I can see it. I'm not just testing like one little piece. I'm testing like how the whole system works together. And I liked that particularly because is my back end functioning the way it should be? Yes. Is my front end functioning the way it should be? Yes. And I did it with one test.
Nice.
Yeah. And then I'm trying to think like back when I was learning and first using AngularJS, I believe we used Jasmine and Karma. But all of it kind of blurs together because they're also similar when in syntax.
Okay.
For me anyways.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting that you say that. Like, I have not worked with Jasmine, but like you mentioned, like Enzyme or Jest. I've worked with like Mocha and Chai, and like I feel like there's definitely like some similarities between them, right? Like, you're testing the functionality of that application. You're trying to make sure that things are working, but syntax wise, like aside from like some things, like I feel like there's many similarities. So I have found, and maybe you have found as well, like that like switching from one library or one testing framework to another can be not too difficult of a process. They're still like going through some docs and things like that. But would you say that, like, would you agree with that?
I would. I think the thing that mainly gets me when I'm switching in between is like the actual expectation system. Because I'm always like, is it dot to dot b dot equal, or is it is? Is it just the word is?
Right.
Things like that. Things like that get me. Whereas the whole like runner setup, I don't think is very different between them.
Yeah. It's definitely, especially if you've gotten used to the testing framework or the assertions to say like is this thing or whatever, as you mentioned, like is dot to dot equal, whatever it might be, and then switching to another one, it's quite the process. It's kind of, relearning a language, right? Or whatever it might be. But yeah, I agree. It's a process, but once you kind of get over that barrier, still a lot of similarities. So I'm curious, because you mentioned, I think you stayed in one of those, you were using Jest, and then you also use Cypress. Did you test both ways? Did you stick more with just end-to-end tests, or did you do a combination of like unit tests, integration tests, end-to-end testing?
The way we started out was a feature would not be done until there was a full unit test for the feature, whatever that included, and then also an end-to-end test.
Okay.
So technically, in the beginning, we'd be, writing our test in Jest, and then we'd have to go over to our Cypress sort of folder and write out what we wanted the like fake browser to do there. We ran out of time very quickly though, and eventually kind of abandoned our unit testing in favor of end-to-end testing. I wish we didn't have to do that, but sacrifices must be made.
Yeah. That's a difficult task. And I mean, just speaking from my own experience, like testing sometimes hit the sidelines a little bit depending on the timeline and how quickly something needed to get out into production, especially when you're involving things like money, and there's timelines, there's other companies who have expectations on things, like something has to give, right? There's only so much time in that case. So it's difficult in that sense. And we always wish we had more time to fully test things out, but such is the way it goes, I guess. So, well, that's awesome. So I guess one more question, as you were like learning these frameworks, I feel like there's a different process for each person, right? Like some tend to like go through more like YouTube videos. Some might read more like blog posts and things like that. What was your process as you were learning these technologies? Obviously, you were on like a team working on some of these things, so I imagine you had some help there. But what's been your process like getting into a new technology or jumping on a new job and having to switch over to something? What's been your process with that?
Sure. In my last gig, I was lucky enough to be given time to learn in between projects. So I'd usually have a week to kind of get myself up to speed without seeing the code base.
Okay.
And so I'm not usually a tutorial or a video type person. I prefer to just be in the docs or just trying things and seeing if they
Yeah.
work. So I would usually just build a project myself. Usually you start out with a to-do app and then go from there if you've got time. And that's usually what I like to do. But I will say also, sometimes there's not a week that you have to learn, and you're just handed a code base and they're like, fix this. Like, okay. So
Sure.
in that sort of situation, I am really just like compartmentalizing. I'm not even looking really at the big picture until I have the time to do that.
Yeah.
And so I would be like, all right, I know this is the spot where the bug is. I don't know what's going on here. So let's go through the docs. Let's check out some tutorials here to figure out what this even is. And then I would just kind of piece together my knowledge through all of those little bugs and experiences until I've got like a bigger picture and can kind of conceptualize the whole framework in itself.
Yeah.
Hopefully that
Yeah.
answers the question.
No, that's great. That's great. I think that's like, I feel like it's such a tricky thing switching to either a different company or working on a different project. Like there's definitely that process of like um how you work through it without like just feeling like completely stuck or overwhelmed. And I think like as you stated, kind of like as with many things as a developer, there is this process of like problem solving. And if you look at it as the overall task, like it's a lot to take a look at, right? It's a big thing. Even just the idea of like pressing a button and making it do something, right? Sending some data somewhere or making something appear. There's so many like little things that go into that. And then if you're trying to learn a new language or something, like that just adds and multiplies the anxiety that kind of can come with that. So I love that idea of like just finding ways to like break things down. If you have that time, like terrific. Take some time to kind of get used to some of the docs and some of the things there. But again, process can be very personalized. Some prefer doing more of those tutorials. I'm like you. I like to get hands-on because 9 times out of 10, I'm breaking shit. And then it's like, okay, well, now I know what not to do, right? So it's part of the fun of it. So awesome. I guess I imagine a number of our listeners here might be either upcoming developers. Maybe they've been working on stuff over a few months. Maybe it's been a year and a half. Cass, you've had like a ton of experience with these things. What would you say to some of these upcoming developers? Like, do I need to be familiar with all of these frameworks in order to be hireable?
Great question. The short answer is no. The long answer is I think it's very valuable to deep dive into one framework and kind of get super familiar with it. Like have that be a specialty of yours. The cool thing about the frameworks is that they all are very similar and it's all just JavaScript at the end of the day. So if you know JavaScript very well, you're going to be able to jump into any framework and get moving pretty quickly. That being said, it is nice to at least be familiar with syntax. So it wouldn't hurt if you're like bored in a few months if you're in school right now, in a few months when you've got a break and you want to try a different framework, go for it. Don't be afraid to do that. But you definitely do not need to know multiple frameworks. And I guess like if you're job hunting and you're like, well, I learned the wrong framework, all these places are only asking for Angular or something, still apply. Chances are good that they're cool with you knowing a different framework.
Interesting. So you're saying if I've learned something like React and a job asks like, hey, we work in something like Angular or Vue, I should still apply? That doesn't...
Totally.
What?
I know, it's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Even if, like, I would say, I feel like a lot of people self-select out of applying of certain jobs, applying for certain jobs, because they think, oh, I only meet 50% of the criteria here.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times those job listings are just like a wish list. And the chances of them finding somebody with all of that experience are pretty slim. So might as well throw your hat in the ring, see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And chances are good they'll teach you also. So
awesome. Continuing that education, I think like that's such a key piece to development, right? Like things are growing, things are changing. Even as you're, like you mentioned, even if you stay in one framework, it's likely to have multiple changes over the years. It's constantly growing. But yeah, I have to agree. I think like this idea of like picking one, and it's hard to say like which one is the one to specifically go with, but get into it, dive deeper into it, and like that knowledge will carry over. There's still like multiple similarities between them. Maybe it's learning some different syntaxes, maybe there are some slight differences in how that data is being managed, but it's one of those things where like you can continue on with that. I was thinking about it when you were mentioning like trying a little bit of everything. I have tried to do that in the past. I've done a little bit of Vue. I've done Svelte is another framework that I've kind of had some experience with, and definitely dabbling with it. And it definitely, to your point, was easier to kind of switch over into it. I didn't get into them super deep, but a lot of similarities, whether it is breaking an application down into different components, whether it's a header or it's a button or it's a menu, whatever it might be. A lot of similar things, but I think it's the fascinating thing about technology is like, I think there can be there's this like idea of like breadth of knowledge. Like you can understand a little bit about everything, but you can also understand a lot about one thing. And I feel like there's still like there's developers out there who focus in on one thing and really become a master at it. They can become a senior developer in React or Vue or whatever it might be. So a lot of different directions, it seems. Well, awesome. You mentioned, so there are, speaking into like hiring, right? And picking which one to choose. What would you say, or what's been your experience? What are like the more popular frameworks or technologies that companies are currently using or hiring for?
Sure. So I haven't been on the job boards in the last few months. So things can change pretty quickly. But the last time I was kind of digging through everything, I think overall, the most popular one I was seeing, the most common one I would see is React. I think beyond that, I saw a pretty equal amount between Angular and Vue. But I will say this, I saw more Angular for US companies and more Vue for overseas companies. I don't know why. I don't know what it means. Yeah. Just an observation.
That's super interesting. Huh. So I guess like that could be like helpful to know about like if you are applying, like I feel like especially in these remote times, like if you're interested in working in various companies or you want to work for a company across seas, maybe that's something to take into consideration as well. So that's super interesting. I was actually pulling up like a list of like some of the various like companies or bigger companies to that are using these frameworks, and some kind of surprised me. I was looking at like Vue. Nintendo actually uses Vue.js in some of their stuff. What else? BMW, one of their apps, uses Vue. Adobe Portfolio, GitLab. So definitely one of those that's quite up there. React, I think, also, like you stated, is like super popular. So you've got Uber, of course, you've got Facebook, Netflix, Instagram, even some parts of like Amazon and things like that as well. But agreed, I think like Angular is certainly there as well. Microsoft Office seems like uses it a little bit. Gmail, Forbes, PayPal, Samsung, so many different companies. So I think to your point, like, it depends where you're looking, but React is certainly one of the big ones, but you're definitely not left behind if you are choosing to use one of these other frameworks. So very cool. Well, awesome. I think any other things that, actually I have one other question. Because we were talking about this a little bit behind the scenes a few days ago, where you were telling me about a time when you were working on a base Angular application and later had to set it up so it connected to an open source Vue application. Do you mind telling me, like, just telling us that story and like what that process was like?
Yeah, totally. So there was a lot of hair pulling for sure, just like and screaming and like no sleep at night. But
Perfect.
I think it was mainly the hard part was kind of like conceptualizing what needed to happen. And in my brain, it was like, all right, I have an Angular application. I'm just going to shove a Vue application in there. And then I like think about having all this weird syntax in one file and just nonsense. That's not the right way to think about it. And so the next kind of process that I took was, all right, what if we just like have an iframe? And so really we just have a website that has an iframe, which is basically just like a window to another website.
Okay.
And that I think would work in most cases. The trick with us is that we needed our parent application, the Angular application, to be able to communicate with the child application. And that's not really possible through iframes. There's like a CORS thing, I think. I don't remember. But there's some sort of like communication issue because they're not of the same origin. So that wasn't going to work. And so finally, I kind of settled on this idea, like, it's really just a frame, like a library that we're putting into Angular. So the path that we finally landed on was we used a package called Rollup. And it basically just bundles the application to be used like a library, just like you would NPM install any library. That's kind of like what it's going to set up your application for. So I bundled this Vue app, set up the Angular app to just like you're required in basically, and start this package. And then we had to utilize a combination of like putting data on the window of the browser and a Vue.js event bus to communicate. I don't know if how we made it communicate is best practice at all, and it probably isn't. But the important thing was that it was communicating, and it is in production right now. So that's been a couple of years. It's still alive, mostly. So it was a success. But yeah, I think mainly like at first it's completely bonkers. But if you start thinking about it as it's really just a library, one can just be a library to the other. It makes a little bit more sense because, your NPM packages are written in all kinds of ways. They might not necessarily match up with your application. So yeah, it worked out. It was a little crazy. But it was good.
That's awesome. Sounds very rough. Sounds like you wouldn't recommend it. If you had the choice, maybe don't try connecting two different frameworks with each other. But if you have to, Sounds like you mentioned, like either using something like iframe, or if you are running into some like cores issues, rollup could be a way to like use it as like use a nerd framework as like a library to the main application. So
There are probably newer tools. It's been a few years, but yeah.
sure. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, always wild stories. I feel like the more you get into development, there's less like best practices per se, and more like if it works, let's get it to do the thing, and kind of patch on some band-aids over time, and hopefully things stay stable. So it's great. No, that's awesome. Always interesting to hear like some of the uh, different ways of like trying to make things connect, which I think is a challenging thing the more complex applications get. So well, cool. I think we're getting close to wrapping up a little bit. I know from personal experience, being an instructor can be super time consuming, but curious if there's anything else you're currently working on or learning right now.
Yeah. So I am working on like a project just on my own with an advisor. And it's I don't want to go into super detail, mainly because we're kind of keeping it secret. And also, like 10 total people on the planet are going to be using this thing, so it doesn't really matter. But it's just an education sort of tool. When I get it available for testing and things like that, I'll share it with you if you're interested. But yeah, that consumes most of my time. It's a Node.js Express Feathers backend, which we just got set up, and a Vue front end.
Awesome. Well, very cool. I appreciate you sharing that. Yes, I would absolutely be excited to be one of those testers. You heard it first on Destructuring Tech. We got a little bit of an insider on what Cass is working on. So keep it a secret. But very cool. Well, awesome. I guess last question for me. Where can people learn more about you, or how might they reach out to you if they have any more follow-up questions?
I think the easiest place is the Denver Dev Slack if you're on it. If you're not, quick Google will show you what that is. I am just at Cass on that Slack channel. If Slack is not your thing, or extra weird non-work channels are not your thing, you can find me on LinkedIn at Cassandra Torski. Trying to think anywhere else. Those are probably the two best places that I'll see your message.
Awesome. Two best ways, either through LinkedIn or what was it? The Denver Dev?
Denver Devs.
Awesome.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, right on. I really truly can't thank you enough for you being on the show, Cass. And thank you to the listener for tuning in, whether you were listening in live on YouTube and being a part of the discussions, or tuned in to us on Anchor or Spotify, which I usually try to have hosted shortly after the stream. Soon our episodes will also air on Apple Podcasts in the next week or so as well. Our podcasts air weekly on Mondays at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. That's 3 p.m. Pacific Standard and 6 p.m. Eastern Time. But until then, thanks for listening in, and hope y'all have a great rest of your evening.